Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the Oxford Guild for inviting me. Allow me to begin with something I could have said but didn't. I'll just read it out. I'm such a passionate believer in Europe that I accept the accusation of being a troublemaker. But I'm not awkward. I just want Europe to work. I didn't say that. Margaret Thatcher said that in 1990. But I'm very happy to endorse her sentiments. And the reason why I came up with this quotation is because as we were walking in the building, I was told this is the Margaret Thatcher Annex. It won't please you very much, Mr. Varoufakis, but what can we do about it? And my response was that the state of politics in this country and in Europe has deteriorated to such extent that even though I spent my youth demonstrating, never missing a demonstration against Mrs. Thatcher, I have to say that I miss her. Make what you wish of this. Just for a moment, go back to the 23rd of June 2016, the referendum. The thing that I lament the most about the referendum was that it was such a wasted opportunity to have a proper, frank, and useful debate. Both sides of the argument infantilized the electorate, and they made it impossible for such a conversation to take place. Both sides made profound, fundamental errors. If you think about it, both treated the European Union as if it was a club, with Britain being a member that is considering whether it's worthwhile renewing his or her membership. A club is a given. Either the services it provides justify the membership fee and all the trouble you have to go through in order to maintain your links with the club, or not. But that's not what the European Union is like. The European Union is work in progress, and to be more precise, speaking of June 2016, it's a disintegrating, frazzling at the edges, or fraying at the edges union. But the same can be said about, I'm afraid, the United Kingdom. That's my title, the title that I came up with as a summary of what I want to talk to you about tonight. A tale of two faltering unions. With Brexit on the one hand, and the attitude of Brussels towards Britain on the other, as indications of the deep malaise both in Europe, the European Union, and in the United Kingdom. Now, let's start with the European Union. The great fallacy in the European Union, at least in the dominant paradigm within the elites of Europe, of Germany, France, of continental Europe. The great fallacy is that the European Union was a remarkable achievement of Europeans, a European design and implementation. It was no such thing. It was an American design and an American implementation. Americans got French and German heads together, banged them, and they said, you are going to form a union. And we are going to set the parameters for it as part of the Bretton Woods system. The attempt to create a stable global capitalist economy after 1944, 1945. By 1946, the New Dealers in power in Washington, D.C. decided that this global system that we're creating, think about it, was extremely ambitious, right? Here you had a common currency area, not just of continental Europe, but also Britain, the United States, of Japan, even India. That was what the Bretton Woods system, fixed exchange rates. When you have fixed exchange rates, you have one currency area. And you have the IMF managing the exchange rates and revising them when need be. And you have the United States dollarizing Europe, because that was the purpose of the fixed exchange rate. So it was a massively centrally planned global economy. And it was the plan that gave rise to the golden era of capitalism. 2 decades of steady growth, minimal unemployment, minimal inflation, and hugely shrinking inequality. It was what created the baby boomers, what created the sense that capitalism had civilized itself. Now, of course, that system had to collapse by 1971 for a very simple reason. The pillar on which it was sitting was American surpluses. America had exited the Second World War as the only creditor nation, as the only surplus producer, and it was actively recycling its surpluses to Europe and to Japan to prop up these parts of the global system that it had created. But by the late 1960s, the United States had no surpluses. And therefore, pragmatic Americans, as they always are, they jettisoned the system that they had created. And the result was the Nixon shock in 1971 and a brave new phase of post-war capitalism, which was exactly the inverse of the Bretton Woods system. So what happened after 1971, 1975, 1980? The United States was getting deeper and deeper into deficit, the twin deficits of the United States, the budget deficit and the trade deficit. And the trade deficit of the United States was operating like a huge vacuum cleaner, which was sucking into the territory of the United States the net exports of Holland, of Germany, of Japan, and later of China, creating demand for the gleaming factories in those countries. And who was paying for the deficit, which was getting larger and larger? Very simple. German industrialists, Japanese industrialists, Chinese industrialists, who were recycling their surpluses, their profits, through Wall Street into the American economy, which was, of course, then closing the loop of aggregate demand. Now, the problem is that on the back of this tsunami of capital that was flowing into Wall Street every day, about 5 billion net a day for 30 years was flowing into Wall Street. Well, what happens when you give 5 billion a day to a banker? They do things with it. It's called financialization. Yeah? So deregulation and derivatives and all that was a natural repercussion of this newfangled recycling, global recycling mechanism. But unfortunately, they did a little bit more of it than the planet could take. If you think about just a couple of numbers to fill your head in, or just to upset you a little bit. In 2001, if I remember correctly, global GDP was about 50. Forget the zeros. Global GDP was 50. The total size of the derivatives was 70. By 2007, the collapse, global GDP had gone from 50 to 70. The derivatives had gone from 70 to 760. So, of course, they collapsed like all good bubbles do, or pyramids, or sandcastles, or whatever. The tragedy is that after that collapse, the American economy could no longer stabilize aggregate demand in Europe, in China, and even in the United States. So you have this ongoing crisis. From 1971, when Bretton Woods collapsed, the Europeans tried to replenish the fixed exchange rate regime. That's the beginning of the euro. The reason why the Europeans had to do this was because the European Union was set up by the Americans as a cartel of heavy industry. Remember the first name of the European Union? The European Communities of Coal and Steel, a bit like OPEC, right? A cartel of coal and steel, which then co-opted car makers, then the French farmers, who had to be given a cut of the oligopolistic profits of German, French, Dutch, North Italian industries in order to allow for free trade to take place. It's called the Common Agricultural Policy, by the way. Then the banking community was co-opted as well. And then, of course, with financialization, the banking sector became the driving force of the European Union. Now, of course, we Europeans, on the other side of the pond, we would like to imagine that this was a fantastic European creation. And indeed, there was always a triumphalism in continental Europe about this creation. With good cause, because it was a magnificent, a highly ambitious project. The fact that you can travel from Greece all the way to France without stopping at borders, with a single market, with the Erasmus program, which I think is a very magnificent program. These are all genuine achievements. The fact that we have peace in Europe for 70 years is a remarkable achievement, given the bloodthirsty continent that we live on. But to think that this was a pan-European democracy and that it was a European project implemented and designed by Europeans is a complete delusion of us Europeans, continental Europeans. So the point I'm going to make now in relation to Britain, to the United Kingdom, is that the United Kingdom was always going to be the odd man or woman out. Because British capitalism was never built upon a cartel. From the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there was spontaneous order, industry, capital accumulation occurred without a central design. It was not a result of a certain Bismarck that decided that he's going to industrialize his country. It emerged in a kind of Burkean or Humean or Adam Smithian spontaneous order manner. Blending together the cartel of continental Europe with the spontaneous capitalism of Britain was always going to be very difficult. Now, of course, the problem was that by the time the European Union was being created, British capitalism was on its last legs, or it was fading very rapidly. So, at the time when the European Union, the European Common Market at the time, was creating in the European elite's mind this fantasy of a European creation that shows how clever we Europeans are, in Dean Acheson's words, Dean Acheson was the US Secretary of State in the 1950s, early 1950s, he said that Britain lost an empire but has not found a role for itself. So when Britain came into the European communities, the European Common Market, the predecessor of the European Union, in this country it was seen more or less or felt as a defeat, whereas for the continental European elites it was a triumph. And that has to do with a fundamentally different structure of British capitalism vis-à-vis European Union capitalism. So let's be clear, there are good reasons for being Eurosceptic in this country. But that does not necessarily mean that Brexit was a good idea. I campaigned against Brexit in this country and I do not regret doing it, even though we lost. But, you know, heroic defeats, I should say, are becoming my thing. But I believe in this country they can be appreciated. I remember when I was living here back in the 80s, Eddie the Eagle and other such characters, and Nick Clegg, you know, we have a lot of heroic failures in this country. So maybe I'm going to have a sympathetic ear in this place. Now, today, if you compare these two unions, the United Kingdom and the European Union, what you have is a very sad, pathetic sight on both sides of the British Channel. You have the European Union, which is celebrating the overcoming of a crisis, the Euro crisis in particular, which is actually getting worse. And you have a United Kingdom, which is celebrating its newfound confidence by cutting its nose to spite its face through Brexit. Because, let's face it, the three circles of Winston Churchill that portrayed his ambition for a dominant Britain, the three circles being Europe, the NATO treaty or the Anglo-American connection, and the Commonwealth. Those three circles have shifted so much, and Britain can no longer pretend to be, if you want, the center of all three circles. 40 years of membership of the European Union has allowed a particular development model or economic model in Europe, in the United Kingdom to emerge, which, allow me to be slightly vulgar about it, is nothing more than a rentier economy. Ever since deindustrialization was a choice by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, with the cultivation of financialization and effectively an economy which is structurally in deficit, trade deficit, to the rest of the world, which is being propped up by financial flows and financialization. That kind of economy, when you cultivate this for 40 years, you cannot simply cut it off, the European Union, and pretend that you're going to rule the waves again to reconstitute the British Empire. I mean, you can pretend that, but it's pretty catastrophic for this country. At the same time, you have a European Union that is so grossly unappealing, because it is failing in its duty to itself to recognize the systemic crisis that it has entered ever since the financial crisis of 2008 has exposed the fragility of its monetary institutions, monetary and fiscal institutions, well, the fiscal institutions that it doesn't have, really, that it is impossible in this country, in the context of a referendum like that of June 2016, to make the argument that we need passionately to support the European Union and to remain in the European Union because it's the best thing since sliced bread. So when I was appearing in various audiences up and down the country, in England, in Scotland, in Wales, even in Northern Ireland, before the referendum, my line was very simple. The European Union sucks, and you have to stay in. Which is not an easy sell, you know. But it was the truth. I remember when Jeremy Corbyn was asked by, I can't remember which journalist on television, between 0 and 10, how enthusiastic are you about the state of the European Union, and therefore how enthusiastic are you about your support for Remain? And what did he say, 4? I would have said 2. But if you asked me, I'm a Greek patriot. If you asked me how enthusiastic I'm about the Greek state, I would probably say 1. But that is not an argument for dissolving the Greek state. It is an argument for fixing it. Similarly, as true Europeanists, those of us who consider ourselves true Europeanists, who have a duty to be highly critical of this European Union, but then ask ourselves the question, is it in the interests of the many to disintegrate it? This is not the same question, are you enthusiastic about the European Union? So, allow me now briefly to say a few words about the European Union and the United Kingdom from a constitutional basis. Because one of the strongest arguments, actually the strongest argument in favor of Brexit, is the argument that the European Union is a profoundly anti-democratic concoction. I think it is. I agree with this argument. Britain has a long tradition of parliamentary democracy, and it is essential, therefore, to restore sovereignty to the House of Commons to preserve the parliamentary traditions of this country. Now, that is a very powerful argument. And anyone who dismisses it on the basis that sovereignty no longer matters needs to be taken to task by every Democrat in the world. The argument that sovereignty does not matter anymore because our states are too powerless to influence the world, you know, the big bad world that we live in, that is an argument that must be treated with the contempt that it deserves. Little Iceland, compared to little Greece, well, actually Iceland is much littler, much smaller than Greece, managed to restructure its debt and to escape the debtor's prison that my country finds itself in because they had sovereignty. Sovereignty is not to be dismissed, and you should never be confused with power. Sovereignty is about being able to make decisions on your own on the basis of a democratic process, to the extent that your limits of power permit you, and it's not to be scoffed at. The European Union, on the other hand, what we have is a process by which we have deferred to the European Union. We've taken sovereignty from our democratic states, from our parliamentary systems, and we have transferred it to a democracy-free zone in Brussels. And that is a very good argument for Brexit. But it's not a clinching argument. And there are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, because the United Kingdom Constitution sucks as much as the European Union institutions do. I'm afraid I have to be very brutish on this. There's nothing to be proud of regarding the UK Constitution. And allow me to link this. This is a controversial point that I shall make. England, outside of London, has been completely disenfranchised in the last 20 years. Brexit is an English phenomenon. And to a great degree, it reflects the fact that most of the English outside London have been disenfranchised by the political system, by the United Kingdom Constitution. Tony Blair's devolution sounded like a good idea, and it was. But sometimes taking a few steps in the right direction is worse than taking no steps. Because the Scottish have a parliament, and they have a government. The Welsh have their assembly. The Northern Irish have whatever they have. Okay? England doesn't. So if you live in the north of England, and you've suffered the travails of deindustrialization since the early 70s, since the late 70s, early 80s, and you have no way of expressing yourself in the way that people further up north in Scotland have, through their own parliament. There is no way of being an English patriot today in a manner that is sensible and non-inflammatory and non-jingoistic, because there is no way that it can be expressed. So this is why I was saying right at the beginning that the Brexit referendum was a terribly lost opportunity to rethink the constitution of the United Kingdom, because, let's face it, you can see that now with the Great Repeal Bill. You're coming out of the EU, and those who brought you out of the EU on the basis of a promise to restore sovereignty to the House of Commons in accordance to the best traditions of the UK Constitution, unwritten but nevertheless glorious, are now brutally murdering the very concept of parliamentary sovereignty by denying the House of Commons, first, the opportunity to debate what kind of Brexit Britain wants, and secondly, the transcription of EU law into British law. And the Cabinet are going to be able to transcribe EU law to create law, bypassing the House of Commons in the name and in the interest of restoring sovereignty, supposedly, to the House of Commons. So, sovereignty is being sidelined, it is being humiliated, depleted, both in the European Union. Look at my country. Our sovereignty has been completely and utterly demolished by the Troika and the European Central Bank. But similarly here, your House of Commons is being treated with, as a rag by this government in this rush towards a wholly uncertain Brexit. So, what should we do? Well, allow me to suggest that we need to, on both sides of the British Channel, to steer or to chart a new course for an uneasy British public and uneasy publics in France, in Germany, in Greece, in Spain. And this we better look at as a joint project. Now, unlike many of the Remainers, I believe that as Democrats we must respect Brexit. We played and we lost. And the idea that Brexit will be reversed because the British people were not sufficiently informed, or they were influenced by Vladimir Putin or such nonsense, this is contemptuous of British democracy. I do not want to see Britain crushed by Michel Barnier and Brussels, and I do not want to see the people of Britain being treated like the Irish in 2004 when they had the referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, and Brussels and the Irish government told them that was the wrong verdict, vote again until we get it right. But what should we do? Well, now I'm going to speak about our Democracy in Europe movement, only in the sense of what we're proposing. What we're proposing is, starting with Britain, because this is where we are at Oxford tonight, and Brexit is in the air, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for years now, and this is one of my arguments when I was telling various audiences, forget about Brexit, because you are not going to get out of the European Union just by voting to leave. It's a bit like Hotel California's last verse. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. You'll be more stuck in Brussels and in the machinations of the machinery of Brussels after voting for Brexit than you would had you not voted for Brexit. Lo and behold, this is exactly what's happening. So, allow me to tell you what my thinking and DM's thinking on what should happen now. First, end this phony negotiation with Michel Barnier and Mr. Juncker. What on earth are you doing, Prime Minister, talking to Juncker and Barnier? These people are grey, suited bureaucrats without a mandate to have any discussion with you. They can have dinner with you, they will bitch about you after the dinner, which they do, invariably. And even if they agree with you, they cannot give you that which you want. And what do you want? You want a long-term agreement with the EU that secures certain privileges of access to the single market without actually being in the single market. For some reason, you know, this is what Theresa May wants. She's never going to get this from Barnier or from Juncker, even if she hypnotizes them and convinces them they don't have the mandate to have this discussion. Barnier said it. He comes in with, as a bureaucrat with boxes, with a list, and he has to check the boxes. And he can't go beside, outside this particular template, so he comes and says there will be a two-phase negotiation. Okay? Remember the two-phase negotiation? Phase one, Ireland, money and people. Do you remember that? So you give us the dough, what, 60, 80, 90 billion, whatever. You settle the Irish border question, and EU court jurisdiction over EU citizenship. So you have to give us that before we move to the second phase. This is like me coming to you and saying, okay, first you give me everything I want, and then we will discuss that which you want. This is a declaration of hostilities. This is what I do in a negotiation if I want to kill it, if I want to make sure that there will be no negotiation. So end this negotiation. And there is only one way of ending it, in a way that is consistent with the spirit of Brexit and with small c conservatism. Here I am as a left-winger lecturing a conservative prime minister on small c conservatism. But that is, you know, the state of affairs at the moment. This is how serious things have become. Tell Mr. Barnier to go home, end these negotiations, and file immediately for a European Economic Area agreement, Norway-style agreement, for a 5-year period after the end of the 2-year post-Article 50 triggering period. The Norway-style agreement has the following advantages. Firstly, it does respect Brexit, because Britain is outside, like Norway is outside the EU, Britain is outside it. Secondly, you do come out of the common agricultural policy, the fisheries policy, you come out of the customs union, but you stay in the single market. So you solve the Irish question, because there will be no need for a border. You sort out the fact that for 5 years, 6 years, counting 2018, the contributions to the EU will continue like Norway contributes for having access to the single market. And most profoundly, you give the House of Commons a period of 6 years during which, firstly, to discuss what future arrangements it wants with the European Union. Secondly, how to transcribe EU law into British law without going through. And also an opportunity to reconfigure the UK Constitution in a way that the United Kingdom can become reinvigorated politically. The anger in England over its sidelining within the political process can subside. This is the way to do it, not by means of creating ruptures in free trade, creating huge queues at Dover, ending the supply chains of Nissan and Toyota and so on, while making promises to Nissan and Toyota that your government cannot fulfill because your budgetary constraints prohibit you from fulfilling. And finally, if Theresa May were to make this move towards a transition period which is small c conservative, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron will breathe a sigh of relief, because the problem, most probably, at least in the case of Germany, goes to the next chancellor. And now Angela Merkel will be able to have a decent conversation with Theresa May without these leaks that the Brits have not done their homework and they're ill-prepared and there are a bunch of videos, whatever it is that they say. So this is what we're proposing. And we're proposing that in the context of what I was saying earlier. that the European Union itself is a work in progress. It will not be the same in 5-6 years. Why? Because it is not sustainable the way it is today. You don't have to take my word, listen to Emmanuel Macron. He gave this Sorbonne speech, which was actually quite good, in which he said that the model by which the European Union has been proceeding in the last 7 decades is kaput, it's finished. We cannot continue like this anymore. We need to reconfigure the monetary union, we need to reconfigure our single market, and most importantly, we have to democratize it and move away from the cartel-like structure that we have now. Of course, he's not going to be listened to by Berlin. But if he's not listened to, within 6 years, there will be some other ruptures in the European Union. We do not know what the situation will be. So buying time, having a small C conservative transition is essential for reconstituting the United Kingdom constitution and for allowing for the maximum degree of certainty in business dealings between the United Kingdom and the European Union, while energizing the House of Commons and restoring sovereignty to it so that it can make the decisions about the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. Now, moving on, and that's how I'm going to close, moving on to what DiEM25 is proposing for the European Union. Look, allow me to frame our proposal by juxtaposing it against the 2 dominant points of view today. What are the 2 dominant points of view? One is business as usual, which is what comes from Brussels and from Berlin. No change, pure denial. And the other is Macron. The German position is a liquidationist position. So if there is a bankruptcy of the state in Greece, let's liquidate it. If there is a bankruptcy in Italy of a certain bank, let's liquidate it. Now, the problem with this is that to liquidate something, you need a state that comes to the aid of the victims of the liquidation. So when the United States government, federal government, liquidated the debt of General Motors in 2009, it had the mechanisms by which to ensure that the creditors of General Motors did not go to the wall. When they liquidated the huge losses of Wall Street, they created TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program. So it is impossible, on the one hand, to liquidate, and on the other hand, to refuse Macron the federal mechanisms which are necessary to absorb the shock waves from the liquidation. But the problem is, so this is the conundrum with, this is the reason why the German position is untenable. But also Macron's position is untenable. Because Macron is asking for a federation now. A federation light, but federation nevertheless. You go to Europeans and you say to them, we want more Europe, more Brussels. They freak out. Because for them, more Europe means more authoritarianism and more of the same austerity-driven, incongruous policies. So what are we proposing? Our third alternative, as DiEM25, is let's simulate a federation. Simulate a federation? Yes, simulate a federation. What is a federation good at? At creating a genuine banking union. This is what FDR did in the 1930s. At creating a degree of mutualized debt so that you can restructure the debt of the more bankrupt states within the Union in a manner that stops them from crushing their private sectors and perpetuating the crisis. Creating an anti-poverty program across the Union, which is what Lyndon Johnson did in the 1960s with the Great Society program, which massively reduced poverty in the United States, helping to stabilize the country. We can simulate all these as well as a massive investment-led green recovery program. We can simulate that by using existing institutions like the European Investment Bank, the European Central Bank. So I'm not going to bother you now with the technicalities, but our proposal is simulate a federation in order to stabilize Europe so that we can then have a discussion, both in the continent and here, about what future constitutional arrangements we want as democrats to live in. My hope would be for a second referendum in Britain, not to annul the first one. Brexit has to be respected, as I said. But if the continent gets its act together, and Britain gets its act together, and England is re-enfranchised, My dream is that by 2025, thus DM25, Britain can have a second referendum and decide to come back into a civilized European Union. I don't believe this will happen. But it is essential that we put out there, both in Britain and the European Union, a blueprint of how it could happen. And then those that work against it happening will have the political and the moral burden on themselves. And those of us who work together across Europe to bring about that which may not come about will be the ones that will have created the networks and the political solidarity as Europeans, which will be absolutely necessary to pick up the pieces in the end. The great conundrum, allow me to rephrase the conundrum that I started my talk with, is that, look, this country, I'm a Europeanist and at the same time an Anglophile. This is a great country. The institutions that you have in this country, like the BBC, like the British Council, like the Tate Gallery, they are immensely important institutions. Don't laugh, they are far more important than any industry you have. You have no industry left. You have the music industry, you have the Tate, you have the British Council. This is your heavy artillery around the world. This is where you are punching above your weight. Your industry is finished. I hope that it revives itself. The industry, some suggestions by Theresa May now have not been bad in the last few days. The new industry policy. Of course, she needs to fund it. The funding that was mentioned was pitiful. But anyway, I'm digressing. This is a great country that is imperiled by the delusion that it is a great power. Simultaneously, on the other side of the pond, the European Union is a great power, imperiled by the delusion that it operates like a coherent country. These two incongruities have to meet halfway. And we have, regardless of whether Brexit takes place, hard, soft, Norway style or not, it is essential, and this is, if you want, what DM25 is about, that we remain very closely coordinated. Those of us who consider ourselves to be progressive Democrats, internationalists, against militant parochialism on the one hand, and the deep establishment in Brussels which simply wants to perpetuate business as usual, and just join forces so that you can have, for instance, a new patriotism in England which gives the English enough confidence to want to be active Europeanists. Thank you very much.